A very good evening and warm welcome to one and all. Today is the second webinar of our webinar series on the contemporary global issues. We are very honored to have Daniel Markey amongst us from John Hopkins University to speak on the very relevant topic at the time, China and the geopolitics of South Asia. On behalf of Kalindi College, University of Delhi, I am Dr. Nivedita, extends a hearty welcome to Professor Markey. In the recent times, the rise of China as one of the leading economies of the world and its profound impact on South Asia has been quite aggressive in nature is a matter of concern. Both China and US see South Asia as an important region and recognize the South Asia's strategy, geography and growing population along with nuclear and terrorism risk. Therefore, today's topic on China and geopolitics of South Asia is of very much of interest to everyone. In today's webinar, we have participants from all over India, not only universities of Delhi, but all over the India. Now, I request Dr. Priyabala Singh to welcome and introduce Professor Markey to our audience. And over to you, Priya, now.
Thank you, Dr. Nivedita, and it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Markey to our audience. So, Professor Daniel Markey is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He also serves as the academic director of the Johns Hopkins SIAS Global Policy Program and teaches international politics and policy. From 2007 to 2015, Professor Markey was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. While there, he wrote a book on the future of US-Pakistan relationship, No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. From 2013 to 2007, Professor Markey held the South Asia portfolio on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the US Department of State. Prior to government service, he taught in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. At Princeton, he also served as an executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. Earlier, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. Professor Markey is the author of numerous reports, articles, book chapters, opinion pieces. His commentary has been featured widely in US and international media. However, in today's context, today's lecture's context, I would especially like to mention that Professor Markey's latest book, China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, published in March 2020, assesses the evolving political, economic, and security links between China and its Western neighbors, including Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So we welcome you, Professor Markey. And so without any further delay, I invite you, Professor, for today's lecture on China and the geopolitics of South Asia. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. All right. Well, thank you for the warm introduction and the kind welcome. It's great to see several of you and to know that despite the fact that it's cold and snowy out here, I imagine it's somewhat warmer and not snowing there. So it's nice to be with you, if only virtually. Now, Professor Priyabala Singh has kindly introduced not just my background, but also a little about my latest book. And I will be talking about that book, about this book, China's Western Horizon. And this book is not really just about South Asia. It also includes some insights from regions that are nearby, including Central Asia and the Middle East. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I do have to admit that a lot of the reason behind writing this book came from my own experience working on and in South Asia. So the impulse to write it emerged as I was working on my previous book, which was also mentioned, No Exit from Pakistan, Because in that book, I started to realize that while many of the dynamics that I was writing about in the US-Pakistan relationship were very old and had repeated themselves over years, throughout decades even, of the US-Pakistan relationship, there were elements that were new as well. And China's involvement in Pakistan and with Pakistan, though that too has a longer history, was seeing some new and exciting dimensions that we had not seen before. And I felt like that was something I wanted to explore more. And as was also mentioned in your introduction, the rise of China as a global, really as a new superpower, was something that was likely to reshape regional dynamics, regional geopolitical dynamics. And the way that I dealt with that in the first book, in my last book, was to think about a kind of a Cold War-like model for South Asia. Whereas in the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union and the United States competing at a global level geopolitically. And this had consequences for South Asia, as I'm sure all of you know, in terms of our relations either with India or Pakistan, and how those were shaped and reshaped by Cold War dynamics. The question that I asked was whether we might see something similar as the United States and China competed at a global level, whether you might see bloc politics emerge in South Asia, with, say, the United States tilting toward India and China tilting toward Pakistan, and a kind of a breakdown in the region that would have some similarities with the Cold War, but of course would almost be the Cold War in reverse, because during the Cold War, it was the United States and Pakistan often closer together in alliance, and India and the Soviet Union often finding common cause. So that was the impulse behind some of my thinking. And it suggested that I really needed to do some more research and try to learn more about China's involvement, and to think about the context of China's involvement in the region, but also to always remember that the region shapes the geopolitical competition at the global level as well. So there's a kind of an interactive effect between global level competition and regional level dynamics, and the two need to be thought about together. And it made me want to learn more about not just what China has done historically in the region, but what China is doing and what it wants to do in South Asia and beyond, and how that is also connected. What China is doing in South Asia is not happening in a regional vacuum. It's connected to what China is also doing and trying to do in Central Asia and the Middle East. So in this book, I think about the sweep of what I call continental Eurasia, which includes South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. So today, what I want to spend some time thinking about and talking about three basic sets of issues. The first being, what is China doing, or what is China trying to do, principally in South Asia, but I'll think a little bit about the broader story as well. How does what China is doing fit into the geopolitics of South Asia as they exist already? What is that interaction? And then how does that dynamic compare to how China is relating to other nearby regions, to Central Asia and the Middle East in particular? So let me start with that first part. What is China doing? What are China's interests? What is China up to? What does it want in Eurasia? So now the first thing, I think I have to be careful here, because when we ask a simple question like, what does China want? We can't give it a simple answer, because China is not a simple place and it's not a small place. And what any nation wants is not so straightforward, but we have to make some simplifying assumptions. But of course, China is complicated. It has many and sometimes competing influences and interests domestically. Although it is a one-party state with a strong central leadership, I think anyone who's an expert on China will tell you that historically it has always faced a welter of different interests from different parts of China. They don't always add up neatly. What various state-owned enterprises may see as their interests, or various state level officials may see as their interests are not necessarily the same as what Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party sees as its interests. And the behavior of China is the combination of these various interests and how they add up. So we have to keep that in mind. But and we have to recognize that this is worthy of many books of study in and of itself. What makes China work, and how is its foreign policy created? So I don't want to diminish how complicated a story that is. However, I think we can make some general observations. The way that China is behaving internationally is today materially and consequentially different from how China was behaving even just 10 years ago, and much different from 20 years ago. And one could say that it's even different today than 2 years ago. So China's behavior internationally and interests appear to be evolving in important, significant ways. And it's important to appreciate what is happening, what is different. So there's continuity, but there's also change. And one of these ways that it's changing is I do think that at least Beijing and those in power with the authority to think about military and strategic issues are already beginning to think a little bit more seriously and focus more intently on what I call the Western horizon. That is, what is happening in continental Eurasia to the west of China. Now, we need to understand that at least for several decades now, China's principal military and economic orientation has been eastward to the Pacific, to its eastern coast, where its shipping and trade, but also its more hostile regional relationships have tended to lie. So concerns about whether it was the Taiwan Strait or the North Korea crisis or dealing with Japan or the South China Sea, all of these oriented China's strategic focus eastward, not westward. But we are beginning to see, I think, an evolution here where a number of important Chinese figures, including scholars and strategists, have spoken and written about the significance of what is happening on China's western borders and have increasingly seen a focus develop there. Now, why is this happening? I think there are multiple reasons for this, and I try to break them down across economic, security, and strategic lines. So economically, China has looked westward. Principally, the principal driver is a thirst for energy, for hydrocarbon energy, gas and oil, coming from the Middle East and from Central Asia. These are the principal things that have led Beijing to look west for economic purposes. Now, there are other reasons as well. There has been a desire and a concern about developing China's western provinces. Typically, they have been at a lower level of development economically as its eastern provinces. As China has gotten rich, the east has gotten very rich, and the west has gotten less rich. So provinces, whether it's Xinjiang or Tibet or otherwise, have fallen behind. And so there has been an effort by Beijing to try to rectify that. And some of that effort to rectify it has led Beijing to want to go out westward and to try to build regional economic connections between those western provinces and countries and states further west in Central Asia and even beyond in the Middle East. And this dates back a couple of decades, but it's really taken on new life over the past few years under President Xi Jinping with the Belt and Road Initiative and aspects of Chinese economic outreach to these countries, including to Pakistan, which I'll talk about more at length, but also countries like Kazakhstan or Iran and elsewhere in the region. So there's an economic motivation here. There's also what I would describe as a security defensive motivation. Now, we, I think, are increasingly aware of the repression and human rights abuses that China is inflicting upon Xinjiang and the Uyghurs of this, principally the Uyghurs, but also some ethnic Kazakhs Xinjiang. But we have seen that this crackdown on political dissent and opposition among Uyghurs in that part of China also came along with a development campaign. So there was a combination of a development agenda, massive investment in roads and infrastructure, and also a political repression. And that has also been combined with an effort to tackle what Beijing believes are the roots of extremism and terrorism, Islamist terrorism, that they believe reside beyond their borders to the West, and to try to cut the ties between what they believe, that is, Beijing believes are terrorists in Central Asia or Pakistan, and the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. And so there's been an effort to both push into these countries and have greater influence in Pakistan and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and even Afghanistan for that reason, but also some degree of economic development agenda, which is driven by.
Professor, you're not here.
I became muted.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I don't know how that happened. Magic. Someone didn't like bottled up and looking eastward into the Pacific rather than westward. So this would be a major strategic shift if it was able to do that. So China has all these motivations. And during the period of President Xi Jinping over the past nearly decade, what we have seen are some changes in the way China even talks about its own view of the world and its own place in the world. It has gone from common to hear in China the idea of keeping a low profile, hiding your capabilities and biding your time. That used to be the watchword for China, to rise at home, to grow in power and wealth at home, but not to show off too much to the rest of the world. Now we are instead hearing things like striving for achievement, showing off that China is now ready to be a great power in the world. And that is a material shift in terms of rhetoric and in terms of Chinese attitudes about its place in the world. At the same time, we have seen China shift from talking about a policy of what it always called non-interference in the sovereign affairs of other states. That is, China would have good neighborly relations, it would claim, with other states in the world, but it wouldn't get involved in their politics or what was happening inside those countries. Now we are increasingly hearing Chinese scholars and analysts talk about creative involvement or constructive involvement in the affairs of other states. That means that the boundaries to Chinese influence in other states are going down, in part because China is appreciating that in order to get things done when it's working with other countries, it needs to have influence inside those countries. And so it's trying to expand its influence. Okay, so that's some broad strokes about what China is up to. Now, specifically, what is it doing? Well, China is already across this entire region the preponderant economic power. So throughout Eurasia, China is the dominant external economic player in terms of its trade, in terms of its direct investments, in terms of its access to markets. It is usually the dominant economic player throughout the region. At least number two, if not number one. It has developed new tools for what I call economic statecraft. So as it has become more influential economically, it has new tools. For instance, it has built new policy banks, new funding mechanisms. We hear a lot about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. This is something that really was pushed by Beijing. This is an effort to try to find new ways to fund infrastructure projects in other countries. And it's driven by Chinese and is a demonstration of Chinese leadership in ways that we didn't see in prior decades. You also have the policy banks that China controls itself, like the Import-Export Bank, the China Development Bank, the Silk Road funds. These are all ways that China is using, new ways that China is using to fund infrastructure investment in other countries. You have the China Sovereign Wealth Fund, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, and you have a new aid agency in China, the China International Development Cooperation Agency, which is still a work in progress, but it's a new institution in the Chinese government that is in some ways modeled on the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. And the idea here is China is not just doing business, but it is also providing grants and assistance to other countries. And it needs the tools, the people, the personnel, the know-how to do that in a smart way. And so it's building that out. When you put these things together, you see Chinese goods, money, technologies, workers, rules, standards, and influence across the region in ways that you have never seen before. So this is a major new change to the region. So that's the economic story. The other piece, the next piece, is a story of political influence. So I mentioned this idea that China is more creatively involved in other countries, that it has shied away or is open to pushing past a strict adherence to non-interference in the region. So its first step in relations with most of the countries of the region is economic. But economic power can bring political leverage, and it can create dependencies with the partners that you're having economic or commercial exchanges with. So whenever you have an economic deal with someone else, there's sometimes a political strings that are attached to that economic deal, whether you meant to do it or not. If your economy, say in Kazakhstan, sells most of its principal export, that being oil or gas, to China, you now have a vulnerability to China because China may not choose to buy as much in one year as another year, or may even just threaten not to do so. And that creates a political vulnerability, or potentially. And at the same time, China is also experimenting with other tools of political influence, media campaigns, building new big global television companies, educational exchanges, bringing students to China or sending Chinese students to these countries, splashy diplomatic conferences and major summit meetings, which bring the leaders of these states to Beijing and show off China's wealth and power. Appearances by China's leaders at major global summits, like Davos meeting in 2017, where President Xi Jinping was really sort of the big global actor or leader on the stage, and President Trump was diminished by that appearance. You have seen the development, as I say, of the global television network, what is now the CGTN, which operates in countries across the world, but also especially in South and Central Asia. You see Confucius Institutes, hundreds of Confucius Institutes, which are geared toward teaching Chinese language and culture, but also bring a degree of Chinese influence to educational institutions, schools, and colleges across the world. And a variety of even what I would consider more worrisome exports of technologies to countries that will enable their leaders to monitor the internet, to censor thinking and writing, to control their populations with tools like facial recognition software and otherwise, to repress political opponents. These are all things that China is doing that helps to build its own political influence in other countries. Okay, so that's political influence. The last piece, projecting military power. Now, China is unlike today's United States in that quite often, at least over the past 2 decades, American power is symbolized by warships, soldiers, military power. China's global power usually starts with the economic side first, then the politics, but now increasingly we're seeing the military piece as well. Over the long term, we have seen the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, engage in a series of institutional reforms to overhaul its structure, to modernize, to become more capable and more effective with its tools. We have seen it build a navy that is not just a navy capable of operating near China's coast, but one with what is increasingly described as far seas power projection capabilities. That means able to operate far from China in other parts of the world, through the Indian Ocean and potentially beyond. We have seen a new Chinese base, naval base in Djibouti in Africa. And we have reasons to believe that there may be other bases that will follow. And this is something new that China wasn't doing before. We have seen China. So we have seen this new military base. We've seen new security operations in Tajikistan and getting into Afghanistan along that border. We've seen major new arms sales by the Chinese to a variety of countries, but especially arms that are sensitive technologies like drones and missiles. And in a lot of these areas, China is poised to overtake Russia as a principal supplier of military equipment. We have seen China involved in joint exercises, military exercises, with countries like Russia and Iran that we had never seen before. In larger ways, in more sophisticated ways. And we have seen liaison activities, that is cooperation activities across this region between China and a number of countries to share intelligence on counterterrorism and on other issues as well in countries, including, of course, Pakistan, but also countries in Central Asia like Kazakhstan and in the Middle East like Iran in particular. So China's doing a lot of new things, and this reflects new ambition and new power and new capabilities. Now, if you look at South Asia specifically, and you think about China's interests, you have to appreciate that China comes, as I said before, with economic interests. And actually, it's not surprising if you look at South Asia, China's main economic interests have been in India, not in Pakistan, in India. Why? Because India is so big. India has an enormous market. India has tremendous opportunities. So back in 2017, bilateral trade between China and India was about $80 billion, about 4 times more than China-Pakistan trade. It's important to keep that in mind. When Credit Suisse, a company that does ratings, financial ratings and otherwise, and a consultancy, did a report in 2017, it predicted that India would probably be the greatest beneficiary of Chinese investments over the next 5 years. Now, we know that was 2017, so we know things have changed a bit between India and China, even just over the past year. But we still have to appreciate that the principal driver in the China-India relationship and China's views about India has tended to be an economic one, and a sense in China that India offered an economic opportunity, a huge market, growth potential that China wanted to be a part of. Now, in 2015, so now 6 years ago, President Xi launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, which I'm guessing many of you have heard something about, while he was in Islamabad. And at that time, they announced 51 different agreements and plans for roughly $46 billion in Chinese investments and concessional loans for things like power plants and roads, ports, rail lines, and pipelines inside of Pakistan. Now, so far, the actual investment in Pakistan by China has amounted to something around a little over $20 billion, which for Pakistan is a big deal. But again, if we appreciate China's broader economic interests in the region, I think we have to understand that at least historically, there has been a greater Chinese interest economically in India by far than in Pakistan. And that has created a mixed set of interests in South Asia for China. Now, if you think about China's security concerns in the region, they have principally focused, as I said before, on its western provinces of Xinjiang, the Uyghur population there, and also on Tibet. And so this China-Pakistan economic corridor was partially intended to be a scheme to stabilize Pakistan and to make it less likely that the influences of extremism, of radicalism, would come from Pakistan and into Xinjiang. That was the Chinese motivation and rationale for some of its development agenda in Pakistan. Stabilize Pakistan, and you will have a better chance of stabilizing Xinjiang. And so some of what China has done is driven by these security concerns. Now, of course, more recently, as all of you know, I imagine, there's been a lot of attention on China's military moves along India's borders and contested areas, particularly in Ladakh and neighboring areas. And some of this also has been driven, some analysts see it, in part driven by China's security concerns about the connective roads between Tibet and Xinjiang, and concerns that India may place pressure on those connecting roads. And so there's a Chinese defensive rationale for some of that. And we can talk about that a bit more later. But clearly there is a more tension-filled relationship with India now, and part of that is driven by China's own security concerns. We've also seen China's investment in Gwadar port, so in Pakistan, along the Arabian Sea. Now, I write in my book that this was an idea that was not originally a Chinese idea. This was a Pakistani idea. In fact, the Pakistanis asked China to build this port. But now that it's being built, it may assume a strategic significance for China as a potential spot along the Arabian Sea, along with Karachi and some other ports, that China can access overland. Rather than having to get there by sea, it can go overland across the Karakoram Highway into Pakistan, southward to the Arabian Sea. And that offers China a land route to the Arabian Sea and then the Persian Gulf, which is potentially useful to China. So what do you see altogether? You see China is seeking economic, political, and even military access in this region. And yes, there is a clear tilt toward Pakistan, as there has been in the past. But until recently, China has also not wanted to see, for economic reasons, not wanted to see violence flare up in South Asia. It has tended to prefer stability, not instability, because it had economic interests in India too. And so that suggests that China's interests in South Asia haven't been all on one side or all on the other side. It's been a mixed set of interests in South Asia. And one question I would open to you will be, does this past year of conflict with India tip China's view about the region in a new and significant way? Or does China still maintain mixed interests in South Asia? And that's something we can discuss. But overall, what all of this suggests is China is running headlong into two kinds of ground realities of South Asia. The first of these is the fact that Pakistan itself, a major partner for China, is a messy and difficult place to do business. So that's something that I want to talk a bit more about. And the second ground reality of South Asia is the India-Pakistan conflict and competition is not going away. And so the more that China is involved in South Asia, the more it finds itself involved, at least indirectly, in that conflict as well. And the broader point I want to make here, and I want to reinforce this, is that the story of China in South Asia is not just a story of what does China want. It is a story about what the states of the region want and how they interact with China and China's behavior. So it's an interactive story. We have to always keep that in mind. The states of the region, whether India or Pakistan or even the smaller states in the region, have agency, they have influence, they have choices, and their choices matter a great deal. Okay, so let's look at Pakistan, and I'll be a little bit faster about this. If we look at Pakistan, we see a very competitive, now I'm looking inside Pakistan, where I've spent a fair amount of time, and I've had an opportunity to do research on the ground for my work over many years now. And what we see there is that Chinese investments have political consequences, and they are not always positive. Even from the perspective of Pakistanis themselves, they have different views about whether what China is doing is good or less good. And this is because whenever a country invests inside another country, it has what you call distributional consequences. That is, some people and groups in that society make more money and benefit more from your investments, and other groups in that society make less money or have negative consequences from your investments. And this is true in Pakistan. So there are winners from Chinese involvement, and there are losers from Chinese involvement. Who are the winners? So far, the winners have been the ruling politicians, so whoever is very much in charge in Islamabad, currently PTI, but previously PMLN, the army, which is often actually controlling the politics of Pakistan, benefits from its commercial relations as well as its strategic ties to China. And big, powerful parts of Pakistan, like the province of Punjab, tend to benefit more than weaker, smaller provinces like Balochistan. So the losers, who are the losers from this greater Chinese involvement? We have to see the opposition figures in Pakistan, opposition politicians, liberal politicians, minorities, reformers, ethnic groups that are smaller, like the people of Balochistan. One example here, one of the leaders in Balochistan observed that China's investment in this port of Gwadar would amount to 91% of whatever profits would come from Gwadar would flow first to China. The rest, the other 9%, would go to Pakistan's federal government, that is the central government, Islamabad, leaving local authorities and people with 0% of the investment, okay, of the profits, of the benefits of this investment. The point here is that locals then are likely to oppose these investments, to see them as not helping their interests, but helping someone else's interests, whether they're China's interests or other Pakistanis. And so that means there has been opposition to the China-Pakistan economic corridor in certain circles, even violent opposition. And you have seen, in particular in Balochistan, a number of terrorist strikes against Chinese workers, against the Chinese consulate in Karachi, because they perceive that what China is doing is not helping them, but actually hurting their interests inside of Pakistan. Similarly, you see that people in Pakistan who are reform-minded, who would like to see the economy become more open to outside investment of all types, are suffering because China is getting preferential treatment in terms of its investments. And so outside investors, whether from the United States or from Europe or Japan or elsewhere, are not getting preferential treatment. And so this is leading to unhealthy economic developments. And politically, we are seeing that liberals and opposition figures who oppose the government or oppose the army are weakened by China's involvement, because China's involvement is shoring up the strength of the leadership of the government and of the army. So what you see is a kind of a mixed story here, but generally one that could be worrisome. This is not, China's investment in Pakistan is not just an entirely good thing for Pakistan, and not just something that will lead to Pakistan being stronger or more unified. In fact, there is the potential that it will leave Pakistan more fragmented and divided, more at war with itself, because the inequalities of that investment are quite clear. So that's inside of Pakistan. And as one report in 2018, an international crisis group report wrote, it said that the China-Pakistan economic corridor, as currently rolled out, risks aggravating political tension, widening social divides, and generating new sources of conflict inside of Pakistan. Okay, so that's the Pakistan story. The regional story, South Asia has for decades, as all of you know, is a tough neighborhood. This is not an easy part of the world. There have been conflicts across borders, and in particular between India and Pakistan, for decades. And of course, the India-Pakistan relationship has seen especially high tensions over the past several years. In 2019, Indian airstrikes inside of Pakistan, Pakistan-based terrorist groups striking in India, the back and forth exchange between the two, raising concerns, certainly here in the United States, that you might see an all-out war again between India and Pakistan. So war is possible. And in this context, China's greater assistance to Pakistan with arms sales, even missile sales, these are not new, but their involvement becomes even more important as China's involvement in the region grows. And China tends to perceive Pakistan's position as having a legitimate right to defend itself against Indian aggression. So China tends to perceive the world, as Pakistan does, as a big, powerful India that is dangerous to Pakistan, and Pakistan has the right to protect itself, and China supports that. The consequence of that is it's complicated, but the consequence is that China backs Pakistan. That tends to make Pakistan more willing, less frightened of India, more willing to punch India effectively. And that in turn makes India more nervous, which makes Pakistan more nervous, which leads to an escalation of potential violence, which is dangerous and destabilizing for the region. So what you may see in China's greater involvement in Pakistan is what we call an emboldened Pakistan, a more bold and risk-accepting Pakistan, because it knows China is willing to back it up. India, for its part, of course, has a history, as I'm sure you already know, of conflict with China, dating back to the 1962 war, and also sees China as a threat to India's hegemony or dominance over South Asia, over the subcontinent, which it has traditionally enjoyed. And so, of course, India is building up its own military capabilities. It's working increasingly with other regional partners like Vietnam or even Australia, Japan, and seeking partnerships with even bigger powers like the United States or France, in part because of its concerns about China and China's greater involvement in South Asia. And India, under your current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, seems even more inclined to pursue a tough approach toward China and in response to China. And partly this is believed to be related to political reasons, that this is good for his domestic political standing. But partly this is also driven by a strategic sense that if India does not push back or hold its ground, then it will be pushed by China, and that will actually be harmful to India over time. And so we've seen the consequence of this in the India-China border conflict, where both sides have been holding their ground and pushing one another back and forth for fear that if they look weak, they'll be taken advantage of by the other side. And that has the potential to spiral again into something more dangerous. So if we think about this generally, we see that China's involvement in South Asia has the potential to be more destabilizing than stabilizing, both because of what it's doing inside of Pakistan and what it's doing in the broader region. Okay, now here's the last big set of points that I want to make, and I'll be very quick about this. But I want you to understand that what is happening in South Asia and South Asia's response to China is not unique. Well, it is a bit unique because every region is different, but it has similarities with what is happening in other regions of what I call continental Eurasia. So it has similarities to what is happening in Central Asia, where we see, for instance, China's greater investment and involvement in Kazakhstan as something that is partly good because it helps Kazakhstan's economy and builds up its infrastructure, kind of like what's happening in Pakistan, but partly potentially destabilizing or creating political trouble because some of the people in Kazakhstan benefit from this investment from China, just like the Pakistanis. Some of them benefit, some of them don't benefit at all and see this as dangerous and threatening to their interests. And so the potential for more conflict inside of Kazakhstan goes up as China is more involved. And similarly, we see that Russia, the traditional dominant player and power in Central Asia, is somewhat threatened by what China is doing in the region. And so of late, they've tried to balance their relations. They talk about how Russia is the gun and China is the purse. That is, Russia provides security and China provides economic wealth and opportunity. But the reality is that China is increasingly going to provide everything, and Russia will be pushed out, if it is not careful, pushed out of this area of traditional influence. And it wouldn't be surprising for Russia and India to feel something in common with this threat of a rising China, because both of them have traditionally been dominant in their nearby neighborhoods. But China, as it gets more involved, will have greater influence. So how Russia responds to China will be something to watch, because it will have something, there will be lessons there for India as well. And in the Middle East, we see in Iran, again, another story that looks something like Pakistan. There were winners from Chinese investment and losers from Chinese investment. Has the potential to be helpful or harmful, and we're watching that play out. It's been particularly harmful for opposition figures in Iran who are worried because Chinese technology will help their state crack down on them, control them, surveil them, and keep them from opposing the state. But it has helped the state in terms of withstanding outside pressure of sanctions from the United States. In the region, though, we see Iran versus Saudi Arabia as a traditional competitive relationship, similar to India and Pakistan, a traditional competitive relationship. And as China is more involved in the Middle East, it has provided weapons, sensitive weapons, missiles, even nuclear capable missiles to Saudi Arabia, even as it sells weapons to Iran, creating more opportunity for tensions and conflict between these two countries. And so even in the Middle East, we see the potential that China's involvement could exacerbate regional conflict, make it worse, make it more dangerous over time, not bring peace or stability. Okay, so let me wrap up. What is all of this? If we pull this all together, what do we see? Economically, we see that everywhere that I've been looking and talking about so far, China is more important than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That China will have influence because of its economic involvement, because of its investments, because of its trade, because of its technology. And there are questions about whether all of this will be beneficial to local economies. Will it help or harm local economic interests and for jobs and growth and the environment? Will this be good or bad? It's a mixed story. Politically, what we are seeing across the region is that at the very least, because China is not interested in promoting free thinking, liberal values, or democracy, it is supporting or helping illiberal, undemocratic leaders across the region. This makes it different from, I think, the United States, but it does not necessarily mean that politically China will dominate or control these countries. It doesn't mean that at all, because, as I've tried to point out, these countries have choices to make themselves. They aren't being told what to do by China. They have their own interests. And those interests are often in maintaining their sovereignty, their autonomy, and that will affect how they relate to China. And then in a military sense, China is throughout the region increasingly likely to be a critically important provider of arms and defense technology to many of these countries, India being an exception, has the potential to fuel regional competition and hostility. And it also has the potential to extend its own capacity to move its own military and project its military power westward through Pakistan, even Iran, as I say, up to even Western Europe. And so what we could see is more regional competition and conflict throughout this area and greater Chinese influence as well at the same time. And sitting here in the United States, this does not look like a very happy story. I will end on that. I will just say it looks like a difficult and dangerous trajectory for the region from the United States' perspective, because you could see greater, China continuing to rise, continuing to project its military, economic, and political power and influence, but not necessarily see peace or stability or the benefits of those things at the same time. So I will end my remarks there. Again, thank you for the invitation to speak with you, and I'll look forward to the conversation now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. That was a very vivid, comprehensive, informative, and wonderful take on China's geopolitical aspects. And you covered all the rising influence of China in economic, political, military sense, how it could act as a destabilizing factor, in fact, in certain regions and stuff. And I think we have a lot of questions coming up. So I'll just quickly move on to some of the questions. Please write your questions in the chat box. I request everyone. So would you like to take questions one by one, or should I go for one by one? Okay.
Whatever is your preference is fine with me. Whatever you prefer.
Okay, so I'll go one by one. So the first question that's there in the chat box is, how does China intend to exploit the 9-dash line in the Pacific?
Look, I think that what we see in terms of exploiting the 9-dash line, I would frame this more broadly. China has a different understanding and ambition for its maritime space than its neighbors do. It's very simple. China, wherever the line is drawn, China believes it's further in its advantage than where its neighbors believe that it ought to be, or where it actually is, and they have a historical disagreement over this. But we should not be bound purely by the legal side of this, because China is not bound and not behaving like it is bound by legal considerations or historical considerations. It is acting like a regional, increasingly like a regional bully, and it is asserting militarily its position on this dispute, as it is in other disputes. And the response to this could be, certainly has been, a legal one, to pursue a response in international forums, legal forums. But that alone is unlikely to be successful. So in terms of China can exploit by, say, building islands or making unilateral claims over space in the South and East China Sea. The response to that, though, has to be a unified response by other powers in the region and beyond, to sometimes include the United States, to demonstrate to China that there are costs to making these claims. And that is the only way, I think, at this point, to be able to respond effectively. China needs to appreciate that it cannot divide its opposition. That is, it cannot sort of isolate a single other country and expect to be able to bully them simply because it's bigger or stronger or wealthier than that country. But to see the world as more unified in response to China, then China will pay a price, whether it's a political price, a military price, or an economic price for its behavior. But that requires coordination and unity among the other powers and players in the region. We're beginning to see more of that, but I would imagine that that is the only way to be able to push back against China's claims.
Okay, thank you. So the next question that I have is how to contain the Chinese threatening neo-colonial pursuit and expansionist policy in Asian continent. And I'll also read down the next question. Is India doing enough effort to combat with string of pearls strategy of China?
So I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that China is, and I didn't use this term in my talk, but China is what I tend to describe as opportunistic in its approach to the region. So some of us, or some analysts, and you mentioned the string of pearls, and this is along these lines, have written as if China has a specific plan for dominating its region, whether it's East Asia and the Pacific or parts of Western Asia, continental Eurasia, South Asia, and so on. I don't believe that Beijing has a specific plan. So string of pearls was actually an idea that came out of American military analysts who imagined that China would identify bases and other locations along the rim of Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific, and would use those bases to expand its military power projection capabilities in the region. They wrote about this now years and years ago, and at the time it seemed a bit like a fantasy, but as we've looked, we've seen China doing more and more that looks similar to this. But it's not, I think, because they have that is Beijing, I don't think has a plan, a grand scheme for precisely where it wants to act, but it takes advantage of opportunities. So when you think about an example would be the port at Gwadar, which I write about. As I said before, this was originally proposed to China by the then president of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf. And when he proposed that China should help Pakistan build its deep sea port of Gwadar, the response from China was, why? This is a ridiculous idea. The port is not commercially viable. And why do we need a port? This is not useful to China. And we don't think, I mean, Pakistan already has Karachi, so we don't think it's that useful to Pakistan either. And it's in a very dangerous part of Pakistan, in Balochistan, where the people aren't so happy about it anyway. Why should we do this? So this was not a Chinese plan. It was a Pakistani plan. And as I had an opportunity to interview President Musharraf, he explained it was a plan that he had come up with because he wanted to have a second major deep sea port in case India blockaded Karachi in a new war with India. And he also thought that a port at Gwadar might be a useful port to limit India's access to the Persian Gulf, and that he would have a strategic benefit against India. So this had a Pakistani motive and rationale to it, not a Chinese one. But over time, China has become more and more interested, and one can imagine in the future that China will in fact use Gwadar as a base. So that is this opportunism. Anyway, my point is just Don't try to think about China having a big plan for regional or global domination. Do think about it as having increasing wealth, increasing capabilities, and growing ambition for being a superpower. These things are all true. Where and when China will take advantage of opportunities often depends on local decisions. Decisions in Pakistan, decisions in Sri Lanka, decisions in Nepal or Bangladesh or elsewhere, or even in India. These decisions will shape China's behavior as much as its own grand plans.
Yes. So there is this next question where you talk about that it's not always China. So you talk about that China is not just, forcing the smaller states to, do the way it wants them to do. And however, there is this question, it is more of an interactive relationship. That's what you talked about. And here is this question which says, as we have seen that China controls 7 of East Asian rivers and can use this as a tool to pressurize other countries in its own interest in the future. Should the other countries come together with a collective agreement on this issue with China or continue to get bullied by its aggressive policies? And the next question says, can we say that China is an emerging hegemon? What will be the stature of Chinese hegemony in comparison to US hegemony in the post-Cold War period?
Right. So the first question on rivers and responses to China's behavior, this really comes back to some of the similar points that I was making about China's behavior in the maritime context. That is, and we can make similar observations about China's behavior in other international contexts where the only effective, say, on trade issues or on technological standard setting, the only way that China can be kept in line on any of these types of issues is through a multi-party, perhaps through a multilateral setting, or simply through countries working together in different groupings to assert their own interests and to demonstrate to China that there are costs to bullying any single one member of their group. And so what I would imagine, and this is something, I mean, now I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I've lived through the past 4 years of President Trump, who has always been talking about America first, but has rarely been talking about working effectively with other groups of states. And he has pulled away from America's traditional alliances and partnerships in favor of working unilaterally, working alone, asserting America's goals alone. But now we have a new president, President Biden, and at the core of his thinking about the world is competition with China. And at the core of his policies for dealing with China is the sense that you will only be successful if you work together with other states. So even the United States cannot balance China alone. The United States needs to work with Europe, needs to work with other Asian partners, needs to work in other multilateral settings, including the United Nations, to find solutions to Chinese pressure or bullying, whether it's on rivers or maritime space or international technologies. In any of these settings, the only solution is one where states work together. Because then China recognizes that there are costs, and we hope will respond accordingly. If it faces too high costs for taking steps, it will choose rationally in a calculated fashion to avoid those steps. You asked about what kind of a regional hegemon China will be. This is a really important question, and I can say there's one set of ways that we simply still do not know the answer, and we have been somewhat surprised by China and some of its behavior, even just over the past year during this COVID environment. We've seen China take a somewhat and sometimes much more aggressive approach, diplomatically, militarily, and otherwise. It's so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, very aggressive, nationalistic kind of rhetoric. This has surprised a number of us because we thought China, as even if we're concerned about China, we thought China would not be an aggressive hegemon, but would be, in a sense, a conservative or risk-averse hegemon, driven more by economic interests than by throwing its weight around. And so there's been some surprise and a greater degree of concern about whether China has taken a fundamental turn toward being a more aggressive and assertive hegemon. And if so, the good news is this is seen as a very negative development by not just the United States or by India, but by just about every other country in the region and the world. And so they will want to do something in response, will want to be more likely to push back against Chinese aggression. So that's one thing that we're not entirely sure. And I think there's at least the possibility that China will pull back from some of this more aggressive approach. If not immediately, maybe over a period of time. At least that's a possibility still. But the other piece, and this is an important piece that we do know, is that as long as China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, we have to know that it will use its economic leverage as power. So we should not see China as simply a trading country that is only interested in making money. It will also see the political benefits and opportunities from economic leverage. So China is not like, say, Japan was 20, 30 years ago, when Japan had still has one of the world's largest economies, but its economy was growing rapidly. But clearly all Japan wanted to do was trade and make more about democracy or liberal values. So if you are someone who cares about those ideas, who believes that you would want your country to be ruled in those ways and hope that that same opportunity would be there for other countries, you will at the very least not see in China a partner for that. So we know that for sure. But there are still things that are big question marks about what direction China will take going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So, before I move on to my next question, I can see a few hands from the faculty members. So, I would like to invite Dr. Deepak to ask your question, but I'll request you to please be very short because we are already running very short of time and there are too many questions. So, yeah, Dr. Deepak, please ask your question. Dr. Deepak? Okay, so in that case, I think I'm going to move on to my next question. So
I'm audible?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Sorry, Priya. Sorry for the interruption. Thank you, Professor Markey, for such an enlightening talk about the issue. My concern is just towards the westward of the policy which you just talked about the China. The westward is treated as by Russians as it's their backyard, especially the Central Asia, and that is going to be the next area where the Chinese and the Russian interests are going to collide. And as you know that the Russia being the erstwhile Soviet communist country and China being the present one, so when it comes to the strategic alliance, they have one of the closest strategic alliance in the world, especially the Russia and China, the kind of deep blue water navy from Sukhoi 30 MKK to the Akula class submarines. So this is something which is really bothering the other powers like United States, who are literally feeding, going away from this power structure of that region. And as you know that in Central Asia Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China has already become the largest donor to the member nations of this the region. So growing influence of China is really a cause of concern for the Russia also, despite being the one of the largest supplier of the military hardware to the Chinese army. So where do you, Professor, where do you see the upcoming relationship between these two powers? When the one rallying point for them is the United States only. That is the colliding the anti US stand with the both countries we should take in the Security Council also and in other issues also. So where do you foresee the future of these two countries' collaboration in the times to come in the light of the competition also? Which is probably. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I would add, and I'd be curious to get your impressions at some point, if not today, maybe in the future, would be the consequences of the China-Russia relationship for India. Because of course, India, you talked about military hardware. India has long had an important military hardware relationship with Russia, and of course has concerns about if Russia gets closer to China, what does that mean for reliability of supply from Russia to India? But to handle your question, I think you've touched on nearly all of the points that I would make, which is, the driving force for Russia and China to come together in the way that they have, which is nearly historically unprecedented, in some ways even a closer alliance than they had before they split during the Cold War. So I don't want to minimize the extent to which they seem to be working well together, but the driver for that is their shared animosity or uncertainty and sometimes hostility toward the United States, and to a lesser extent toward the West, so to speak, which includes Western Europe at times and parts of East Asia. So they're driven into each other's arms by their sense of opposition to other things. Well, that is an important glue for a strategic relationship. A sense of a mutual threat, but it isn't a deeper shared interest in the sense of something positive, something that they seek to grow together, and it is marred by friction, and the friction in Central Asia is an important friction, because as soon as you start to look at it from a Russian perspective, you appreciate that China is beginning to so-called eat its lunch, to take over parts of the region that have historically been Russian dominated, and to assert directly or often indirectly Chinese influence. And so the question in my mind is about timelines. And because there is no one answer to your question, we have to look at timelines and we have to look at trajectories. So which thing will happen sooner? Will Russia find a way, maybe in a post-Putin world, find a way to significantly warm its relations with the United States and the West? How long might that take? Is that something? It's certainly not happening today. It doesn't seem to be. It's the prospects. It seems like a somewhat distant prospect, but possible. So that's one timeline. And then the other timeline is, how quickly will China assert its true dominance and influence over Central Asia, to include Kazakhstan and the other stands of the region? How quickly is that happening? That seems to be happening pretty rapidly. Certainly on the economic front, it's already succeeded. Well, the question is militarily and otherwise, how quickly that will happen. And if you want to throw in a third timeline, it would be a technological one. How quickly is China's capacity to re-engineer or reverse engineer Russian equipment and then to leapfrog Russia as a military and other technological provider, how quickly is that developing? Play with these three timelines and that will give you the answer to your question, because, if, sorry. I'm hearing someone else. But anyway, if you play these together, you'll get a sense as to whether the Russia-China relationship will unravel because of their friction faster, or whether they will stay together because of their mutual hostility toward the United States and the West. And Russia will continue to see itself become a junior partner in a relationship with China, but have to accept that as the cost of its hostility with other players. That's how I tend to think about it. No clear answer, but those are the kinds of things that I would be watching closely.
Thank you. So I have a question about when we talk about South Asia, and a lot is happening in Afghanistan right now, the Afghanistan peace process. And I was wondering that if once, US completely withdraws from Afghanistan, what could be the role of China in that case? How do you perceive that? So, and I'll take the next question also. This is from Rahul Mishra. I have a question for our respected speaker. To put it simply, how the current Sino-USA rivalry different from what the world witnessed during the Cold War period? And you also make a point that China's rising to power has been different, but as I see it, the methods used seem pretty similar to both the countries to gain dominance. So would you like to take those two first?
Great. So there is a huge question, and which will loom large in the decision making of the Biden administration about whether to leave Afghanistan and how quickly. This, I believe, is currently still unresolved. I do not think that the Biden team has made a decision about what to do, whether it will in fact follow the letter of the negotiated outcome with the Taliban and remove U.S. forces by May, or whether it will seek a longer involvement. Either way, China sees this as a no-win outcome for China. If the United States stays longer in Afghanistan, China does not see that as a very positive development, because China has always been frustrated with having U.S. forces so close to China's border there, and has seen it as an unnatural reality of having the United States so deeply invested militarily in Central Asia, and China hasn't particularly liked that at all. However, if the United States leaves quickly, it leaves a mess that has the potential to spill over in the region, either because Afghanistan reverts to civil war, or at the very least, because there's a greater possibility for terrorist activity in Afghanistan, which has the potential to threaten China too. So China, and I've had opportunity to speak with Chinese analysts, and they just don't see a happy outcome. Everything looks bad. It's just bad or worse. Probably at this moment, they would prefer that the United States stay a little longer to avoid a rapid unraveling of Afghanistan that will be even harder for China to deal with. China has no interest, as far as I can tell, in placing a military presence in Afghanistan. If the United States leaves, I do not think that China will step in and fill the vacuum in any significant way. I think they would stay somewhat insulated from this, and probably something that will not probably be a happy news from India's perspective. I imagine that China will depend increasingly on Pakistan to provide security, so to speak, in Afghanistan, and to try to help China avoid the worst outcome in Afghanistan from its perspective, that is the rise of anti-Chinese terrorist groups inside Afghanistan. So they'll rely on Pakistan to help them deal with that. So that's on Afghanistan. The differences between the Sino-US competition and the Cold War, the core difference is that the United States and the Soviet Union were effectively what we now call decoupled. Their economies were almost completely separate. And remember, the Soviet Union, being an actual communist or attempting to be a communist socialist economy, had a state-owned everything and did not participate in the American and Western capitalist economy. These two economies were kind of operating with a bit of a wall in between them throughout the Cold War. Now, at times, certain trade would take place across the wall or illegally under the wall. American blue jeans could be bought on a black market in the Soviet Union. But remember, this was a huge barrier between the two countries. And so their competition took place politically, diplomatically, militarily, but not economically. Think about the US relationship with China. It's almost completely upside down in that way. The two economies are completely intertwined. China owns a tremendous amount of American debt. American investment in China is huge, continues to be huge. American consumers buy Chinese creations. Chinese consumers use American technology. The global economy is one that is really the most globalized and interconnected the world has ever seen. And this is partly because of the interconnectedness and the way that supply chains have been built, which has been driven by kind of America's view of how global capitalism should work. And China has been a part of that. So competing in that environment becomes completely much more complicated, because threats to the American economy are actually also threats to the Chinese economy. And threats to China's economy are threats to the American economy. So we rise and fall to some extent together. And so now, as the relationship has deteriorated, we have had to give more thought to this idea of decoupling. And I could speak at length about this, but in very simple terms, it's just the idea that which parts of the economy do you want to insulate from China? Which things are you most worried about? And would you actually like to build a new wall between the United States and China on the economic front? And that would allow you to compete more effectively. So rather than putting the emphasis on greater cooperation, it's on competition, but narrowed cooperation, because you recognize that the new version of the global economy, if you were to compete across all facets of that economy, it would be so totally destructive for both societies, for the entire global economy, that no one would survive it. That's a very big difference. And so we have to think about this global competition differently because of the economic component. That's the most important thing. There are many other differences, but that's the most important.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. So I'll take just two more questions, and after that we'll say, because there are just too many questions right now. Is the disengagement we are seeing today in Ladakh success of the India's policy and diplomacy, or is it China's effort to change its narrative after the backlash it received about the pandemic? And the last question of the session that I would take is, why China still has the United Nations permanent membership? Even China is not even democratic country, nor China follows any UN rules. Kindly answer. So these are the last questions of the session.
So yeah, the great question. So I'll just take the last one on UN Security Council membership. There's never been a rule about what you have to be, democracy or otherwise, to be a UN Security Council member. So of course that's not the issue. There's always been a strangeness to the United Nations Security Council in that it is at some level its membership is determined historically. So you still have a France or a Britain as members, even as other countries have become quite powerful in their own right, say Germany or India. And there is also a power politics component to it. In the UN Security Council, permanent members are powers, great powers, and it has never mattered, and they have veto power based on their military and economic and political power outside of the United Nations. It's never been a purely legalistic or conditions-based membership. It has almost nothing to do with that, which is interesting, because of course the United Nations has always been portrayed as a multilateral institution founded on certain principles, but at its core, power politics are still essential. On Ladakh and the most recent developments, which is generally a positive thing to see Indian and Chinese tanks moving away from one another rather than toward one another. This is something that generally is a good news story. But the question hints at a broader set of issues, which is, what's really going on here? What led China to take these actions in the first place? And what is leading China to try to reduce tensions now? Is this a purely tactical calculation on China's part? And if so, what is the tactical calculation? Is it that India did such a good job of effectively finding a tactical solution to China's behavior, taking the heights, and then being able to leverage that position for China backing down? Or is this related to a broader global story of China wanting to look like not such an aggressive power, maybe even wanting to look somewhat nicer to India as it contemplates future multilateral events, BRICS summit or other summit events where it wants to basically warm ties with India again and pull away, or maybe it has to do with China's concerns about the United States. I mention all of these things because we don't know. No one knows, except for top Chinese leaders themselves. The rest of us are left to speculate because they have a closed government. They do not tell us what their motivations or logics actually are. And when they tell us things, we don't know that we can trust them because it isn't a democracy and they are not accountable to their people. They're in no way transparent or open. They are opaque and closed. So that leads us to wonder, for instance, something I'm wondering about. If they pull away from the border on this instance, does that mean that they'll be willing to pull away this summer? Or does that mean that India and China may be back at a near war crisis this summertime? Maybe not there, but maybe somewhere else along their border area. I'm worried about that because I do not think that one tactical disengagement spells the end to a crisis or conflict along that border. So it's something to watch very closely. I'm concerned about it. We'll be watching.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such a great session. And I would like to invite Dr. Manila now for a formal vote of thanks. Yeah, Dr. Manila.
Thank you, Priya. Professor, I express my gratitude on behalf of the Political Science Department, Kalindi College, University of Delhi, to Professor Daniel Markey for accepting our invitation and giving us his precious time. Thank you very much, Professor, for excellent talk, and which I'm sure will benefit the participants, especially our students. And I want to thank our principal, ma'am, due to some reasons she could not join, Dr. Anjula Bansal for her support, encouragement in organizing this event. And my colleagues and faculty members from various institutions who have attended this talk today, and students, I would like to thank you all for participating. And the last but not the least, our webinar series conveners, Dr. Priyabala Singh and Dr. Nivedita Giri, and Kalindi College Political Science Students Union office bearers. You have done a wonderful job of organizing this international webinar series. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the entire department. Your efforts are hugely appreciated. And thank you once again, Professor, for accepting our invitation and coming here today. So our next lecture series of this webinar series will be on the 26th March, 11 a.m. And the speakers of the series is Professor Ian Hall, Graffiti University, Australia, and he is going to deliver a lecture on India's East Asia strategy. So I request all the participants to join again on 26th March. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Markey. It was
pleasure.
very enriching. Thank you, sir. Great. We will have you once again. We'd like to have you once again. Yes, sir.
I would love to see you all in person next time.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Have a good day. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Good evening. Good day to you. Yes.